Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. Keep up with the latest dinosaur discoveries and science with us. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 493rd episode, we're going to be talking about a new paper all about dinosaur intelligence with an emphasis on T-Rex. We also have an interview with Kallie Moore from the fantastic YouTube series PBS Eons. You're likely familiar with that series because it is super popular and for good reason. It is so enjoyable.
Yes, very well done and fun to watch. We also have Dinosaur of the Day, Xiaosaurus, which is a little forest dweller, kind of like a dinosaur wood nymph.
And we have a fun fact. It's a new Titan reptile that was just named from the Triassic, but it's not a titanosaur.
Ooh. Well, you'll have to let me know what it is later.
Yeah, I will explain. But before we get into all of those fun stories, we want to thank some of our patrons for helping to make this podcast a reality. And this week we have a new patron to thank, and that's Tricerabeth. Thank you very much, Tricerabeth, for joining. And then rounding out our shoutouts, we have Bobby, Brooke, DC Cassandra, Devin, LIO, Lorosaurus, Tara, Ben at Jurassic Site B, and Robert.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being a Dino-It-All and being part of our community.
And as a reminder, one of the possible perks for being a patron is getting an ad-free version of the show. So if you want to check out the different levels of our Patreon, head over to patreon.com/iknowdino. Jumping into the news, I'm going to kick it off with the update on dinosaur intelligence. This one made a big splash in the news.
Yes. Well, when you're talking about how smart T-Rex is, of course, everyone wants to talk about it.
It's a little unfortunate because just last week we themed our episode around dinosaur brains.
Yes.
And then right after we finish that episode, this new paper comes out and we're like, okay, I guess we're doing another episode about dinosaur brains right away.
It's a slightly different direction.
Yeah, it's more about intelligence than the actual brain itself, but it does get into brains because there's obviously when you're looking at fossils, the brains are going to be a big part of how you're trying to determine intelligence.
Well, brains don't fossilize, but there are ways to still study them.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that we were looking at actual fossilized brains, but we're looking at brain cavities inside the skull to estimate the size of a brain. So for this new paper, it was written by Kai Kasper and others and published in the Anatomical Record. Darren Naish is one of the co-authors and wrote up a companion blog post. And first of all, the hero image that Darren Naish chose for his blog post is maybe the most upsetting piece of paleo art that I've ever seen.
It's upsetting?
It is very upsetting. It's by Andrew Mini-Ear, and I have to say, how dare you?
I see, because the ankylosaur.
Yeah, it's a drawing of a T-Rex using a tree trunk as a lever to flip over an ankylosaurus. And the sheer audacity to show my baby getting flipped like a pancake is just terrible. And I do not approve of this art at all.
I liked the comment in our Discord, though, I was kind of flipping it the other way, that the ankylosaur was using a stick against the T-Rex.
Yes, but the caption on DeviantArt is even more offensive than the image itself because they clarify, quote, a pair of clever tyrannosaurs exploit leverage in order to safely overturn an ornery ankylosaurus, end quote.
Oh.
And I think the caption should read, quote, an innocent ankylosaurus is brutally ambushed by a pair of vicious tyrannosaurs, end quote, would be more fitting.
It's not wrong if they were using a tree trunk as leverage.
That part isn't the problem. It's the clever tyrannosaurs and the ornery ankylosaurus
I see.
that I take the most umbrage with.
So it's not the art, it's the caption.
Yes. And there is also the possibility, I think we've mentioned this before, because armadillos, what most of them do, there's only like one species that can really roll up fully into a ball, the three-banded armadillo.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them sort of dig a little bit and then they turn themselves into a speed bump, basically, because they have the armored back and then they get their soft parts underground. And there are hypotheses that maybe that's what ankylosaurs did too, sort of dug down a little bit and then got on the ground. So even with a tree for leverage, they might not have been vulnerable to this type of attack.
I see. You're saying the ankylosaurs were more clever than depicted.
Yes, I think so. But it is also possible that if the tyrannosaurs were super clever, they could dig a little bit of a hole and shove a tree trunk under there and then get the leverage that way.
We weren't there. We don't know.
Yeah, definitely don't know. And we don't have any sort of impressions of tree trunks being used to leverage over ankylosaurs. But setting my personal feelings aside, it is a very well done piece of art. The tyrannosaurs look really cool.
Mm-hmm.
The ankylosaur is anatomically correct despite being very sad. And if you could flip an ankylosaur, it's likely it would end up turtling, getting stuck on its back with its soft underbelly, vulnerable to attack. And even if it didn't get stuck for that long, in this piece of paleo art, there's a second T-Rex waiting to chomp on it as soon as it's flipped. So it wouldn't even matter how long it got stuck. But the big question is whether or not T-Rex was smart enough to use tools like some modern birds do. I like Darren's summary. He said, quote, "The general consensus on non-bird dinosaurs is that they were most likely on par in cognitive terms with turtles, lizards, and crocodilians, though bird-like maniraptorans were likely more similar to birds like emus and ostriches," end quote.
And generally, I don't think people talk about emus and ostriches being particularly intelligent.
No, ostriches, I would say, are infamous for hiding their heads in the sand when they get scared. Although, by the way, that is not true at all. Ostriches do not hide their heads in the sand or dirt or any sort of underground crevice. They usually flee. They can run extremely fast, although occasionally they do fight back against threats and they can kick really hard.
Mm-hmm.
So no, they don't shove their heads in the sand. I was reading some accounts on why people think they do that, and they think it's likely that they were either observing an ostrich tending to its nest or eating or something.
Oh, so it was misunderstood.
Yeah, just completely misinterpreted what the ostriches were doing. And I kind of wondered too if it was a situation where it's like, oh, there's a lion way over here and there's an ostrich and it's scared, so it's hiding its head. But really the ostrich isn't scared at all because it knows it can run fast and it doesn't need to start running until the threat gets much closer. I see that all the time with animals. Like, isn't it going to react?
Yeah. You see that even with, say, you're at the park or the beach and there's some birds hanging out and then some kid goes to chase the birds. It takes a while until the birds take off or even start running.
Yeah, they know how fast they are and they can see how fast the threat is. And yeah, they can figure out that closing time. So going back to T-Rex, that would mean that it's probably closer in intelligence to an ostrich than it is to a baboon, which is what was previously proposed last year, I should say, which is a big difference. There's a big difference between a baboon and an ostrich in terms of intelligence. So that paper last year was by Susanna Herculano Haussel, and she argued that T-Rex was about as smart as a baboon. That paper got a ton of attention.
Yeah.
We covered it pretty extensively.
We did. And I think it was kind of a fun starting point because we expected that there would be further research on this after that paper came out. And
yes.
Here we are.
Yes, exactly. So this is a follow-up for that paper. And the focus of that paper was on estimating the number of neurons in the telencephalon, which is most of the brain. Anatomically, that's basically the same as our cerebral cortex. If you're familiar with brain anatomy, that is like 80 to 90% of our brain. Humans have about 16 billion neurons in our telencephalon. And according to the study, Ornithischians were mostly under 1 billion, but she estimated T-Rex in the 2.3 to 3.3 billion neuron range, which is what all the news was about because that gets you in the baboon level of neurons. And she also argued that the raw count of neurons is what matters and not some sort of proportional number of neurons to body size. She also compared T-Rex to parrots and crows with similar neuron counts, saying that those birds can, quote, solve problems and create their own tools and build their own culture, end quote, implying obviously that T-Rex could do those same things.
Like using a tree to flip over an ankylosaur?
Yes. I think that would be a theoretical thing they could do if she is right. But there were several potential issues with the study. One of them is that the study assumes that some dinosaurs were cold-blooded and others were warm-blooded, which led to some really weird results because warm-blooded dinosaurs were assumed to have higher neuronal density than the cold-blooded ones. And so, for example, Triceratops ended up with a third of the neurons as Protoceratops because they thought Triceratops was cold-blooded and Protoceratops was warm-blooded, which just seems really weird. And not a lot of people agreed with that analysis. In addition, they also used total brain mass, but didn't factor in brain anatomy. So, for example, T-Rex had large regions of the brain for sight and smell that are included in the estimate, but obviously those aren't useful for higher level thinking, like making tools or communication or any sort of like societal interactions.
Mm-hmm.
Modern birds also have a very different brain structure than dinosaurs, with a larger cerebrum where complex problem solving happens. And the last big criticism that we talked about was that brain neuron counts don't scale well, especially with archosaurs. So the exact way their brains are structured makes them harder to scale, and scaling up a bird brain to 1,000 times the size to a T-Rex probably vastly overestimates the number of neurons and how intelligent they would have been. So jumping ahead to this new paper, the first piece is what size brain T-Rex had, and they talked about how brain size estimates for T-Rex have ranged from about 29% of that brain to endocranial cavity, or BEC ratio.
So how much space the brain takes up in that cavity?
Yeah, you were talking about this last week and saying that usually people were using 50% BEC as a typical amount, which would be a brain filling up half of the brain cavity.
Mm-hmm. But it was a little bit higher for most dinosaurs.
Yes, although Herculano Hausel, with her 3.3 billion neuron number, got that from a 100% brain to endocranial cavity ratio, which is probably on the high side. I think last week you were saying that theropods had a brain size of about 70% of their brain cavity.
Yeah.
That was based on the shape of the dome on the top of the brain cavity. Basically, a bigger brain needs more space, and the typical way for the brain cavity to expand as evolution is creating these larger brains was by expanding that dome inside, like the domed chamber for the brain, upwards in the skull. But neither of these papers used 70% as a BEC for T-Rex. The null paper last week didn't give a specific estimate for T-Rex. Maybe we'll get that in a later paper. But this new paper also took a stab at brain sizes.
Ooh, stabbing brains.
Not literally stabbing brains. They took a metaphorical stab at estimating a brain size.
Yeah.
But they started out by pointing out the previous research, and they considered the best estimates from previous research to be in the 31, 42, and 57% categories. So a little bit smaller than the 70% from last week, but that was a really broad theropod generalization. But they weren't looking just at T-Rex. They wanted to look at all dinosaurs because that original paper was talking about all dinosaurs. Like I said, there was Protoceratops, Triceratops, all sorts of other dinosaurs in the mix. And so they plotted brain sizes from previous research against body size. In other words, how much larger the brains are in larger bodied species, because there's going to be some correlation there. Most dinosaur brain sizes scaled roughly like sauropsids, aka reptiles, although sauropods and some ornithischians had proportionally smaller brains. So our favorite dinosaurs were maybe not as intelligent.
Womp womp.
If the brain size is the most important factor. But they found that most birds scaled along a different line. That line is higher up the brain size axis. In other words, the birds consistently have proportionally larger brains than the reptiles of the same size, and also larger than most dinosaurs of the same size. And that was all the way across the board, regardless of the body size.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked about that in the paper last week, too. That bird brains were bigger, I guess, proportionally compared to crocodilians.
Yes, and this doesn't include the largest brained birds. Those were even on a separate line, even higher up the brain axis. But some of the more bird-like non-avian dinosaurs were split between the two lines. So some of them look like they were along that line with the birds and the bird-sized brains, and some of them looked like they were along the line of the reptile-sized brains.
Interesting.
Those dinosaurs include things like Oviraptor, Velociraptor, Ornithomimus, and some of those other close relatives. T-Rex is also in between the lines, although it's a little bit closer to the bird line than the reptile line. And T-Rex isn't that distant of a relative to modern birds, although it's also not that close. It's sort of in between. It's like close-ish to a modern bird. It's nowhere near being an ancestor to modern birds, but maybe it's like a distant cousin, more so than a lot of other dinosaurs. So overall, the new paper says the Herculano-Housel paper overestimated the size of dinosaur brains by estimating them like bird brains. And all the time I keep saying bird brain, I keep thinking bird brain is an insult. But really, bird brain isn't a very good insult because...
I think of crows and ravens alone.
Yeah, there are lots of intelligent birds. I guess it depends on the type of bird, though. Maybe it should be like gull brain. Or just pick a different animal like fish brain.
There we go. Wouldn't want to insult the gulls. They're just biding their time.
They don't speak English. It's okay.
That's what they want us to think.
So the new paper took a T-Rex brain and scaled it down within the brain cavity to what they considered a more reasonable size. And they came up with 1.7 billion neurons using a bird brain scaling. But using a reptile scaling, which they argue is more likely, they think it would have been under 0.4 billion neurons. And that would give them fewer neurons than a corvid, the smart birds that use tools like you were just talking about. And obviously with a much larger body size as well. I like the way that they sum it up in the paper saying, quote, a substantially improved understanding of the relationship between neuron counts and other biological variables, especially cognitive performance in extant animals, is required, end quote. Which is an excellent point. Basically, if we don't have a good understanding of how modern animal neuron count affects their intelligence, we have no chance at figuring it out with extinct animals, and we don't have a good grasp on living animals. Typically, we don't think that the total neuron count is the most important factor in intelligence of an animal. It's definitely a factor, but maybe not the most important factor, because brains are extremely complicated, and some animals seem to do a lot with small brains. For example, the Eurasian magpie can use tools, express grief, and can recognize itself in the mirror with under 500 million neurons. Meanwhile, other animals have large brains and don't seem to do all that much with them, at least as far as tool use or problem solving is concerned. Apparently, giraffes have over 1.7 billion neurons, which is up in almost like primate territory, and giraffes act like just about any other herbivore, grazing on food and not really doing all that much exciting stuff.
They just do what they need to do.
Yeah. And I mean, that's probably the answer, right? They have a big enough brain to do what they need to do. And we don't know exactly how many neurons are required to accomplish those different tasks. We kind of need to figure that out first before we can go back in time and figure out what is going on with dinosaurs, because with dinosaurs, we're limited to just using the bones and making estimates from that. So you have to be able to look at a modern animal skull, figure out how big its brain was and how smart it is before you can apply that same logic to dinosaurs. And we're just not there yet.
Maybe one day.
Yeah, we definitely could get there, but just not at the moment.
I like that these studies are coming out, though, and people are starting to think about these things.
Yes. And I think when that paper came out arguing that T-Rex was as smart as a baboon, and part of the point of that paper was saying we shouldn't be using stuff like the reptile encephalization quotient, which is just a simple scaling saying, well, that animal seems to have a little bit larger brain than you'd expect for an animal of its size, so maybe it was smarter. This is definitely a better approach where you're looking at something more specific to the anatomy of the brain and the neuron count. Where it's headed in the right direction more than just a mass of brain versus mass of body.
Mm-hmm.
But it might still need more tweaking. And I think one of the ways it could use more tweaking is rather than just looking at the overall brain, trying to figure out which piece of the brain is the most important for which type of activity. So if the problem solving part comes from this part of the brain, we need to figure out how big that part of the brain was in a dinosaur, which sometimes you can do from the brain cavities. And then we might be able to figure out some cool stuff from that.
Yeah.
The most we usually talk about is stuff like it's got a big lobe on the brain for the vision or for the smell. So we think it probably had a good sense of smell or a good sense of vision. It'd be cool to expand that into some more behavior. And we'll get on to our interview with Callie in just a bit. But first, we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now on to our interview with Callie. But of course, we have an extended version of this interview. So if you would like to hear more about all of her work, there's a lot of awesome stuff that she has done. There's a little bit of an NSFW, not safe for work, conversation about dinosaur mating that we had on there. But because this is family friendly, that's going in the premium content. If you want to hear that stuff, head over to your premium content feed if you're a patron. And if you're not a patron, you can always join and then listen to it. We're joined this week by Callie Moore, who's the collections manager / fossil librarian at the University of Montana Paleontology Center in Missoula, Montana. Also co-host of the YouTube channel PBS Eons and executive producer for the documentary Why Dinosaurs. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on I Know Dino.
We're excited to have you. So you're a paleontologist and also a science communicator. What's a day in the life like for you?
Oh, it really depends on the day. For the most part, like I definitely go in two different directions with my job. If I don't have any outreach going on, a day in the life is going to my office, answering emails, and then overseeing a bunch of volunteers. I usually have about 10 to 15 volunteers with me every semester, and these are students from all across campus, and they're working on usually inventory or curation projects. So they're going through the collection and double checking the information that's in the database with what's ever on the tag, or they're actually entering in specimens in our database.
Awesome. Are most of the volunteers students, or is it all walks of life who volunteer?
It's definitely all walks of life, but the majority of them are students at the university. And I have students from every single major, I think, at this point. I've had math majors, history majors, obviously geosciences and biology, but really history, forensics, pharmacy, I think, one time. I've actually had a couple student athletes, a tracklete, and a football player. So it's just kind of it's everybody loves dinosaurs, like for real.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of students. On the other side of my job is a bunch of outreach, and so I do public tours. I go into the classrooms. I give public lectures, that sort of thing on the science communication side.
Nice. That sounds very fun to meet all these different students from all sorts of different backgrounds who all they know is like, I really like paleontology or I really like dinosaurs and I want to be here.
Oh my gosh, I love them so much. I call them my kids. I have students that come back year after year. I've had students that volunteer with me all 4 years of undergrad and go on to do great things, usually outside of paleo, but still in the realm of sciences a lot of times, which is fun to see where they end up and what they do. I'm just like a proud mama hen. I'm just like, oh my gosh, look at what you did. You're so great. So, and it's also really cool to see how they came to, like how they found me or how they found the Paleo Center on campus, because it's very small. It's basically just the collection, some displays on the first and third floor, but I don't advertise a lot for me or for myself because I just don't have enough hours in the day to be my marketing person as well as the collections manager, as the outreach coordinator and volunteer supervisor, And so it's always very interesting to see how they find me and how their love of paleontology or fossils came out. And then why aren't they a paleontologist?
Yeah.
Like, why are you going into microbiology then? But I give them a hard time a lot about like, oh, you should switch, you should be a geosciences major. Some of them have changed majors or added it as a minor, but they're fun. They're fun kids for sure.
That's cool. And so you said there's a little bit outside of the collections in this building. Is it something that people, if they're in town or driving through town, could stop at and see some paleontology goodness?
They can. So we have, like I said, we have some very low budget displays on the first and third floor of our building. The Charles H. Clapp building, not the best of names, but he was a really cool dude back in the 1930s and 40s. He was the only geological based president our university has ever had. So he was classically trained geologist, and we have his field notes and stuff. It's pretty cool. But anyways, yes, the first and third floor. But the kicker is that the buildings are only open during university business hours. So like 8 a.m. to like, I think they started locking up the buildings at like 7 nowadays, and then they're locked on the weekends.
Okay.
So that's kind of the unfortunate part of not being like a standalone museum, is that we don't have more flexible hours. And I know a lot of people visit Missoula like on the weekends. So, but we do have our collection, some of our collection on display at the local Montana Natural History Center. So it's a small little natural history center in Missoula, and they have a pretty good paleontology display. Actually, it's great. I helped with it, so it should be good. But that is open on the weekends. And so if you wanted to see more paleo in town, you could always stop there.
Nice. And I have to ask, does the Paleontology Center have any dinosaur stuff in it?
We do. We
Nice.
have a teensy little bit. So we have only about 2 lane cases. So they're about, I don't know, 30 by 40 centimeter case or inch cases, I would say, somewhere in there. The standard lane museum cases with dinosaur bits and pieces. But we do have a T-Rex skull cast on display on the first floor. And it's very, very low to the ground, so you can stand right next to it. Actually, if you get to see or watch the Why Dinosaurs documentary, I'm standing right in front of it for like all of my parts of the interview.
That looks nice.
Yeah, it's great. And it's it used to be known as Peck's Rex. Now it's known as Montana's Rex. And it has a ton of great pathologies. It's a really great T-Rex specimen, actually, to get to talk about so many different aspects of Tyrannosaurid biology and behaviors and things like that. So it's definitely the centerpiece of our display area.
T-Rex skulls tend to take all the attention
just
in
about to say
paleontology collections.
Cool. I can't argue that either. I mean, I'm not a dinosaur paleontologist, and I'm still like, man, that thing is so cool.
Yeah. So you've been the fossil librarian there for quite a while now. Have things changed at all in the time you've been there? Or, what has the process been like for overseeing this collection for a number of years?
Well, let's see. When I was first brought on, part of my job description and what I was going to be doing was overseeing a massive renovation of the collection. So before I was hired, my supervisor at the time secured a ton of grant money to renovate our collection space and to get it into a space saver compactor system. So a lot of book libraries have these now, and this is an electronic one. So I don't have to push a button and like things move around, and it's very, very cool. It felt like getting thrown into the deep end because I had just graduated with my undergrad and got hired at the University of Montana. And it was like, boom, take care of this collection that you've never seen. You don't know what's in it, but organize it into this big fancy compactor system. So I had like 3 months to figure out what we had and how to organize it. And then it was like 7-10-hour days to get the whole collection moved out of the room and then moved back into the space saver collection.
Wow.
It was a lot. But then, oh, it looked so good. It was so fancy. Oh, so nice. And we kind of, I feel like we peaked in about, I don't know, 2015 or so, somewhere in there with the amount of students that we had. There was a paleontology professor and he had grad students. I had a ton of volunteers as usual. We're doing all these cool things. And then the professor retired, and he retired during a massive budget cut. And the university, yes, the university has yet to rehire another paleontologist. So we lost like all of our paleo students basically, or they graduated and we just never got any more back. And so I feel like we are not as active as we used to be. I am very active, very, very active, but on campus, academically in the paleo sciences, we are not as active as we used to be because we don't have any grad students. We don't have any undergrads taking a paleo track or anything like that. But myself, very, very active. I give more lectures now than I ever have. I do more outreach than I ever have. We haven't quite brought back National Fossil Day since the pandemic, but I don't know, maybe this year we will. I don't know. I think we're going to have a screening of Why Dinosaurs actually during the week of National Fossil Day. I think maybe it might work out to be that week, but so there's some things, but yeah, it has ebbed and flowed definitely over the years since I've been there. Whew, it's been a while now. Yeah. It's been a while.
You're also the co-host of Eons, and you've been co-host for a while now. Is it about 7 years?
Yeah, we launched in 2017. So yeah, we're coming up. We're about to, well, we mentally have finished season 6, but to the public, season 6 won't actually end until like April or May. And then we'll roll into starting filming season 7. So there will definitely be a season 7 of Eons. And yeah, I was brought in really, really early. I actually, I was invited by Caitlin Hoffmeister, who's no longer with Complexly. She's branched out on her own now, doing amazing things. But I guess she discovered me. I'm using air quotes here. And she was like, hey, you should be on SciShow Talk Show where Hank Green interviews cool people with cool jobs. And I was like, yeah. And little did I know that this was like a tryout for Eons. Well, they had an idea of Eons. They like the one sheet hadn't been written up. You know, they hadn't gone any farther, but they were like, you know, we need a dinosaur show. And so after that interview, they were like, hey, you did really good. You want to do a screen test? And I was like, sure. And so I did a screen test, and then they got back to me and they were like, you did really great on the screen test. Do you want to come do another one and like have a bunch of people in the room to give you like instructions and directions and stuff? And I was like, oh, okay. So I did that one, and they were like, everything's good. We're going to have Hank and one of our other writers, Blake DiPastino, will be your co-host, and we'll let you know. And I was like, oh, okay. And like a year later, I get this random email that's like, we got funding. We start filming next week. And I'm like, that's still happening? Like I didn't know that sometimes these things take a very long time to get funding and approval and all this stuff. And so, yeah, like when I was brought into Eons, it was kind of just a figment of the imagination. Like we're like, ooh, we have an idea, but it hadn't come together yet. And so that's when PBS was like, hey, we want you to do a show about dinosaurs. And Blake always jokes that he was like, well, I'll raise you the history of life on Earth. And so it went from being a dinosaur-centric channel to a history of life on Earth channel. And I was like, that was the most brilliant change you could have made, because literally we have like 4 billion years of life history to talk about. Like we'll never run out of anything to talk about.
Yeah.
There's never going to be a time where we don't have something to talk about. And so since then, the show has grown immensely. Our team has grown immensely since then. And yeah, we're all just really proud of it. PBS is proud of it. Complexly is proud of it. I love it. I love working on it, being a part of it. And so not only do I co-host, but I do a lot of content consulting. So I fact check everything: podcast scripts, YouTube scripts, TikTok scripts. If there's something to fact check, I fact check. I double check graphics in our YouTube episodes only right now, but I'm wondering if I'll start graphic checking our short form content for like TikTok and reels and stuff like that. But right now, just that. I write about, 80-ish% of the social media content. It's posted by somebody else, but I write the content for it.
Mm-hmm. Do you do a lot of fossil hunting?
Yes and no. I get out when I can. I have all of these random research things that I don't want to write them up. So I just keep switching from like, I like to do meta analyses. And so I do all of these deep dives into the literature, into primary source material, and find everything under the sun about one topic, and then I move on to the next one. And so one of these topics that I'm working on recently is there used to be a coal mine in Missoula in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they also found fossil leaves. And the fossil leaves have been known, and people have told me about these fossil leaves. We have like 10 in the collection, but I've never put much thought farther to that. And now I've switched gears, and now I'm like 100% got to find these fossil leaves in Missoula. And so the main locality is on private land, and I am working to get onto that private land, but it hasn't happened yet. And so the goal is to find some road cuts or some railroad cuts that are public that we could collect on. So that's what we're going to do. It's just I'm hoping we will find something. We will find something, but it's basically just to find new localities. And so I can collect a whole bunch more of this. So we will have a bunch in our collection, so I don't have to rely on all these other places, because there's like 4 other institutions that have a bunch of material from my own backyard. And we don't have it. It's so embarrassing, I feel, as a collections manager, to not have a good representation of the fossils that are found 2 miles from our building.
Well, you're working on it right now.
Rectify that.
Yeah.
I'm going to fix it. Yeah. And then I'm also kind of working on this other area that's about an hour and a half away from here that has these amazingly soft body preserved amphibians. It's actually a plant site too. I'm not a paleobotanist, but I keep getting pulled back into paleobotany. Oh, it's the hardest of the subjects of paleontology. I feel the synonymizing that happens in paleobotany is just unreal. So I've tried to shy away, but for some reason I just keep getting pulled back to leaf sites. So maybe I'll become a paleobotanist one of these days. I don't know. But anyways, yeah, there's this other locality that I'm kind of working on too. It's about 30 million years old. The fossils here in Missoula are about 39 million years old. So they're fairly young in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, when you said coal mine, I was expecting like Carboniferous.
Right? This is a really young coal bed. Yeah, this is not what you would anticipate. And it's a high-grade lignite too. It's not technically like shiny black coal or anthracite or anything. It's a high-grade lignite that what normally people would do is make briquettes out of it. And there was a huge push to get a briquetting plant. Like I said, I've gone through every single newspaper that was published between 1850 and 1950 looking for information on this coal mine. And it's really fascinating. It's been fun to learn more of the history of Missoula, and most people in Missoula don't know that we had a little coal mine in the North Hills for, I don't know, off and on for 40, 50 years.
Yeah, that's cool.
It is cool. I see this. You were saying you're an encyclopedia of paleo knowledge. You're just adding to it.
Yep.
Just dumping it in.
Which I think fits well because you also wrote a book, Tales of the Prehistoric World. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, that was so much fun. I was approached by Neon Squid, the publisher, and they were like, "Hey, do you want to write a book?" And I'm like, "Actually, yes. I've been trying to write a book for several years now, and I haven't lined up with any publishers, and they were like, well, we have this idea for a book. And I was like, that's the exact idea I had for my book too. And I was like, this is perfect. And so they're like, great. And I was able to modify it. They really wanted it to be heavy on dinosaurs, and it is very heavy on dinosaurs, which I get. Dinosaurs sell. It's great. I love dinosaurs too. But I was like, you guys, we have so much of the history of life, and there's so many cool stories. And so I was able to work it out where I was able to give basically each major time period a story at least. And so there's like the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian. There's 6 stories for the Paleozoic, and I think there's about twice as many for the Cenozoic, and then the rest of them are all in the Mesozoic, which is great. But yeah, I was able to weasel out some real early stories. And so like the oldest story, the first story in the book is talking about, 3.5 billion year old stromatolites. And the youngest story is talking about the last mammoths that were alive 4,000 years ago. And so I really wanted the book to go through time sequentially. And so it goes oldest to youngest. I wanted to talk about well-known localities and well-known finds as well as not so well-known places. And so, I mean, I could have talked about a lot of things, but I tried to have a story from every single continent. I wanted to find people that like a diverse group of paleontologists that found these fossils. I had a lot of goals for myself, and finding the Venn diagram, the middle of that Venn diagram for every single time period, and to hit all of those check boxes was a bit of a challenge. I will say there needs to be a lot more work in the early Cretaceous. My goodness. That was probably the hardest to fill, was the early Cretaceous, shockingly enough. But yeah, it was so much fun. It was a whirlwind. It took me about a year to write from start to finish. And I think it turned out great. The illustrator, Becky Thorns, did an absolute phenomenal job with the illustrations. And she's a children's book illustrator. She is not a paleo artist. So there was definitely a learning curve for her. I'm assuming she'd probably have a minor in paleontology at this point. But I got to check all of her drafts before, and I had a person to go between, and I'd be like, oh, the feet are wrong, or the face looks like a beak, and we call them raptors, but they weren't birds, like all sorts of random stuff. But yeah, it was so much fun, and the reviews have been really great on it. I think people have really enjoyed it. And it's a really pretty book too. My favorite one was like, if kids had coffee tables, this would be a kid's coffee table book. And I'm like, yes, that's good.
That is a good one. Well, we have a couple of listener questions.
Yeah.
We asked ahead of time because we knew like our audience also loves Eons.
Because you're famous in the paleo circles.
Yes.
In the small world of paleontology.
That's the best way to be famous. You don't want to be famous like you can't go to the grocery store famous.
No, and I definitely, what's funny is nobody recognizes me in town. I've never been recognized in town or something like, are you Callie from Eons? I also wear a ton of makeup on screen, and I don't wear makeup on my day-to-day life. And so I feel like I have my like Eons persona and then my normal everyday below the radar persona. But if I go to any tangentially paleo anything, yes, definitely recognized. Definitely recognized.
Well, all right, so our first listener question is, what are some of the most unique specimens, dinos or otherwise, in the collections of your paleontology center?
Like I said, we don't have a whole bunch of dinosaur stuff. So definitely the coolest dinosaur thing that we have is a cast of a skull. But otherwise, our collection is very heavy in Cenozoic mammals that lived in Montana between, let's say, 15 and 30 million years ago. And during this time, Montana was way warmer than it was today. And there were tortoise that lived up here. Now, tortoise can get themselves into some trouble if they get into mud and they get stuck, and it's very sad. So we have several fossils of perfectly articulated tortoise legs that have the osteoderm, so that have like the skin bone or whatever. All of those little osteoderms are completely in place, but we don't have the rest of we just have the legs. So
Oh,
they like got
weird.
stuck in the
Oh.
mud, and then something came by and ate everything else and
Oh,
moved it around, and all we have are these legs left.
It's not usually
Very
what you
sad.
picture with a tortoise.
no.
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's all carapaces because that's, like, usually
Right.
what you get.
We do have a lot of those, but the legs are absolutely phenomenal. They're so neat because, like I said, those osteoderms are perfectly in place, in situ, in life position. So you can really like see their legs. Those are pretty cool. And then we also randomly have a fairly good collection of Burgess shale,
Hmm.
and that's incredibly rare outside the Smithsonian or the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum. And because those two institutions have basically been in charge of those sites since forever. Well, I believe in the 1920s, sometime in the 20s, a professor from the University of Montana went on this massive road trip all across North America to collect data and photos for a geology book that he was going to write. And he swung by the Walcott Quarry. Now, in the 1920s, it wasn't a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Like, literally, Charles Walcott was still out there doing his thing. So he goes by and he's like, "Hey, Charlie, what's up?" And he's like, "Hey, how's it going?" And he's like, "Good. Can I collect some stuff?" And he was like, "Sure. Collect all you need, whatever." And so he did. And so he brought back quite a bit of material from the Burgess Shale, and it's in our collection. And we're probably one of the only institutions outside of the ROM and the Smithsonian that has a collection of it.
Wow.
Nice.
And so that's always really cool to be able to show people real Burgess Shale material that wasn't stolen or anything like that. Like, we got it legitimately. I actually found a newspaper article that talks about this donation of fossils that he collected during this huge tour. And I was really hoping that there would be a picture in his book. I found his book, bought it, and I was hoping that there was going to be a picture of the Burgess Shale in his book to be like, "Oh my God, yes." And there wasn't. I was super bummed. Yeah. He mentions it, though. He talks about it, but no pictures of it. But we do have a small collection of Burgess shale, which is, again, just really cool. Really cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Definitely one of the most interesting and important fossil sites anywhere in the world.
Well, you are doing so many fantastic things, and I feel like there's a lot of places our listeners could go if they want to see what you're up to, but best place to go online to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so I'm like the last one in the world without a website. And I'll tell you now, I bought my domain and I'm in all of my free time that I wish I had, I'm building out a website. So there will be a website that will have so much information about me and upcoming events and things about me. But right now, probably the best place to either contact me or to see what I'm up to is my Instagram. So at fossil_librarian is probably the best place right now. But as soon as I get my website up, it will be linked on my Instagram.
Okay. And we can add a link too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So eventually it's going to look great. But it takes a little bit to build those out, huh? So I'm getting there. This has been on my to-do list for like 4 years now, and it just keeps getting pushed to the bottom. And I was like, I guess with an executive producer title, I should probably have a website. I should probably, we've gone far enough that I feel like this needs to happen. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to work on it. Well, eventually it'll be there.
Let us know when it's up.
Yeah.
Yes, I will, for sure. I'll let you know. But yeah, Instagram's probably the best spot.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a delightful conversation, and I learned a ton of new stuff, as I always do, from your videos and interviews and all your work. So thank you so much for talking to us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and it was lovely meeting you two in person.
You too. Thank you so much, Callie, for coming on our show. We had a great time talking and hearing more about PBS Eons as well as all your other work. We'll get to our dinosaur of the day in just a moment, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Xiaosaurus. which was a request from Tyrant King via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. It was an Ornithischian dinosaur that lived in the Middle Jurassic in what is now Sichuan, China, in the Xiashaximiao Formation. It was herbivorous and lightly built. It's on the small side for a dinosaur. It's estimated to be about 1 meter long, or a little over 3 feet.
That is very small.
Yes. Its femur, or its thighbone, is only 11 centimeters, or a little over 4 inches long.
Yeah, that's much smaller than ours. I'm used to the femurs being just these huge measurements, way bigger than ours. What are ours, like a foot and a half?
Maybe this one's in the running for, would make a good pet.
I think so, yeah.
It walked on 2 legs. It had a long tail, short arms. Its legs were muscular, and it had a small head. It also had leaf-shaped teeth. 2 individuals were found in 1979 and 1980, and then it was named in 1983 by Dong Jiming and Tang Zilu. The type species is Xiaosaurus dashanpensis. The genus name Xiaosaurus means dawn lizard, and it refers to the age of the dinosaur.
Meaning that it was early.
Middle Jurassic, yeah. The species name refers to Dashampu, which is the township near where the fossils were found. The holotype is a partial skeleton with a jaw fragment with a tooth, neck and tail bones, an upper arm bone, a partial left thigh bone, and a complete right leg. And then the second skeleton found includes a right thigh bone, vertebrae, a phalanx, a finger or toe bone, a rib, and 2 teeth. There was briefly another species. Well, it wasn't really accepted, but in 1992, Peng Guangzhou reclassified Agilosaurus multidens as Xiaosaurus multidens, but again, that wasn't really accepted. And Xiaosaurus multidens later became Xiashaximiao. Xiaosaurus was too fragmentary to be easily classified, and sometimes it was thought to be a nomen dubium. A 2005 study found it to be valid, though, and said that it was an Ornithischia inserte sedis, so some sort of Ornithischian.
That is just one notch shy of being an invalid name.
Yes.
Because Ornithischia is very broad.
Yeah, but hey, still works.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one notch above that it's like a Dinosauromorph or something.
Xiaosaurus lived in a lush forest. Other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include Ornithischians like Xiaosaurus and Agilosaurus, as well as sauropods. One of them is Omesaurus, which is known for its really long neck, and Xiaosaurus, which is known for having a tail club, even though it's
nice.
a sauropod. Yeah. And then there's also theropods, many types of theropods, and stegosaurs like Huayangosaurus. That one had pointy spikes on their backs. Some other animals that lived around the same time and place include fish, amphibians, turtles, crocodiles, and pterosaurs.
And our fun fact of the day, again, is that a new titan reptile was just named from the Triassic, but it's not a titanosaur.
Then what is it?
Well, let me take you on a little journey. Do you remember in the Royal Tyrrell Museum, there is a massive animal on the floor? It's over 21 meters, almost 70 feet long, and it is described as weighing over 80 tons.
The massive animal on the floor that I remember at the Royal Tyrrell is Borealopelta.
Yes, Borealopelta is the most memorable animal in the Royal Tyrrell Museum, so I could see why you would say that.
Although I don't remember its measurements offhand.
It's not 80 tons, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Or 70 feet long. This one that I'm talking about, it's almost in a hallway, and actually it's not a dinosaur, even though the Royal Tyrrell Museum is mostly famous for its dinosaurs. It's actually a huge species of ichthyosaur.
Oh.
It's from the Triassic, which is long before dinosaurs reached those enormous sizes. Specifically, the ichthyosaur it's called Xiaosaurus. It's named after Mount Shasta. Maybe it's Xiaosaurus, which is the 5th largest mountain in California at nearly 3 kilometers or 2 miles tall. So it is significantly smaller than Mount Shasta, but still a large animal. But this new titan from the Triassic, again, is not a titanosaur.
Is it an ichthyosaur?
It is. It's named Ichthyotitan, which literally means titanic fish. There's a new paper by Dean Lomax and others published in PLOS ONE. And on Twitter, Dean said the, quote, specimen was found in 2020 by fossil hunting father-daughter duo Justin and Ruby Reynolds. Ruby was then 11, who are co-authors. End quote.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, I think it's pretty fun that they get to be co-authors as well, and also that they found this really important animal.
Mm-hmm.
There was another huge jaw that was discovered in 2016, and then when it was described in 2018, they didn't give it a species name because they considered it too fragmentary, but now it has been referred to Ichthyotitan.
All
so if you're
right.
keeping track of your large ichthyosaurs around, that's the same species now, thought to be the same species. Ichthyotitan is also thought to be a close relative of Xiaosaurus. That's why I brought it up. They only have a partial jaw of Ichthyotitan, unfortunately, compared to Xiaosaurus, which, if you remember at the Royal Tierra Museum, they've got a huge part of the body. They got flippers, they got most of its back, its huge head, all this stuff. It's incredibly impressive. They kind of, from what I remember, shoehorned it into kind of a hallway because I assume they didn't have enough space. Sort of like Patagotitan at the AMNH, where it's like sticking out of one room and into another because these huge fossils, it's like, where do you put these things? They built the building. They didn't intend to have a 100-foot-long animal in one of the rooms. They got to squeeze it in somewhere. But if you look at that partial jaw of Ichthyotitan and you scale it up based on Xiaosaurus, which is pretty similar, they gave Ichthyotitan an estimated length of about 25 meters or roughly 80 feet.
Wow.
That would make Ichthyotitan about 10 to 15% longer than Xiaosaurus. But if you scale it based on Bisanosaurus, another large ichthyosaur, then the estimate is reduced to about 22 meters or 72 feet, which is still a meter longer than Xiaosaurus. So,
still big.
Yes, still extremely big. Even at 72 feet, it's in the range of an adult blue whale. I feel like I need to do a little aside on blue whale sizes because in my mind, blue whales are 100 feet long. But what I've realized is that even though there are reports of blue whales that are about 30 meters or nearly 100 feet long, that is really far from typical. There are, I think, reports of about 80 blue whales reaching that size out of over 250,000 that are documented. And a lot of those accounts are like the worst accounts with the worst data. So it's possible that those were just errors and not actually as big as they were claimed. So 30 meters or 100 feet might be about as big as a blue whale could ever get. And the maximum size varies a lot, both by sex and location. So females are bigger. And for example, an average adult female blue whale is about 22 meters or 72 feet long if they're in the eastern North Pacific. But in the North Atlantic, they're about 26 meters or 85 feet long. So that's 4 meters or 13 feet longer, just switching from Northeast Pacific to North Atlantic.
Something in the water.
There is something in the water. I don't know what it is. Maybe better food. The North Atlantic is the modern equivalent of where the known Ichthyotitan specimen swam, for the record, where these 85-foot-long blue whales are currently swimming. But I think comparisons between blue whales and Ichthyotitan get a little bit out of hand because some people would say, you know, blue whale's 100 feet, so it's not quite as big. But that would be sort of like comparing this random Ichthyotitan to the largest ever blue whale that's been found out of over a 250,000 that we've measured. And I think that's good to keep in mind for our sauropod comparisons too, because if you find a sauropod that's 100 feet long, that's just an average sauropod. Or, you know, we don't know. It could be bigger than average. It could be smaller than average, but it's probably not the biggest ever. When I was looking into it, most of the infographics I found showed blue whales at about 100 feet long, but that would be like saying humans are about 7 feet tall.
And only some humans are.
Very rarely do you find a 7-foot tall human. One last quote from Dean. He said, "At 202 million years old, the fossils narrowly predate a global extinction event that eradicated these giants. Marine reptiles never reached such size again." Even though ichthyosaurs lasted until the Cretaceous, the largest group went extinct at the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event. And that basically makes the end Triassic for ichthyosaurs, similar to the end Cretaceous for dinosaurs, because dinosaurs didn't go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, just the largest ones did, because we still have birds. And ichthyosaurs continued into the Jurassic, but by the Jurassic, a really large ichthyosaur was considered something that was about 20 feet long, like a quarter of the size of these ones at the end of the Triassic.
Well, those big ichthyosaurs are cool, though. They're no sauropods.
Yeah, I mean, anything can get big in the water. The real feat is doing it on land. Feet.
There we go. And on that note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for another great episode next week. And in the meantime, if you want even more paleo goodness, we just dropped a new I Know Paleo episode on our Patreon. So if you're at that Triceratops tier or higher, you can head over to patreon.com/iknowdino and listen.
It's all about hell ants, which are some really ferocious ants. And we know a decent amount about them because some of them got trapped in amber, including with their prey, which is pretty amazing.
Yes. And the pictures are a little terrifying. Thanks again, and until next time.